text and hermeneutics. Prior to coming to Chapman, he taught at the University of Cincinnati from 1994 to 1997 and the University of Missouri from 1982 to 1992. Farmer is active in scholarly research. He chaired the Bible and Contemporary Theologies group of the Society of Biblical Literature and was a member of several other SBL groups, especially those dealing with apocalyptic literature and hermeneutics. And he served on the advisory council of the Process and Faith program at the Claremont School of Theology. His publications include 5 books and over 5 dozen essays and articles in the areas of biblical studies, hermeneutics, and ethics.
Rosie.
He also appeared.
Move forward just a little bit this way and move the slide the bench.
Okay.
He also appeared in a 2-hour History Channel documentary, for which he also served as a history consultant. In January 2011, he and his wife, Patricia, moved to the beautiful Pacific coast of Ecuador for an extended sabbatical. After 5 years of living abroad, they returned to the United States and now reside in Missouri, where he's currently the minister of Oakland Christian Church, a Disciples of Christ church in Columbia. Since 2011, he has taught online courses in religious studies and philosophy at Brandman University, which is part of the Chapman University system. So I'd say without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ron.
Well, thank you, Pat. It's good to see some of you. I can see a few faces and I recognize all of you. In fact, as I was preparing for this, I found something I wanted to share with you. So I'll be able to share my screen. Can my mine be able to share? Can you fix it where I can share the screen?
Yes, hold on, Ron.
Okay.
Before we start, I would like people in the audience who know you from way back in to stand up and introduce themselves. You may have forgotten your name.
No, forget it.
You don't want to. All right. Okay.
We want time for Ron. Okay, Ron, you should be able to share now.
Okay. Let me give this a try here. Yeah, now I can. I thought I would just start by this picture. This was taken in 2010 by Wendell. And we were in the, I forgot what that room was called, but this was during, I think when we usually met in the big assembly room, but you were having a play at the time. And so we weren't in the fireside room because there was something else going on. So we were meeting for a period of time in here. But that's how we used to meet. And I remember all of you quite fondly. If you look around, you may see some people you recognize there from the back. If you're used to seeing what they look like from the back, that is. But I wanted just to start with that.
And we're in that same room, in the same direction. We're looking exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
By the way, Ron, one more thing. There is choir practice going on right now. So some of our attendance is not here, they're there. And I didn't anticipate that. So we've lost some of our audience to the choir practice.
But we are recording, Ron. We'll make this available on our website.
Okay. Well, I've always enjoyed being with you. You're such a delightful group of people to share with and discuss. And it's been a real pleasure. So I was delighted when you asked me to do this by Zoom. And I guess we've all become somewhat used to Zoom over the pandemic. So here we are. I'd like to start with what I sent to you as a little blurb, and that is to remind you that I'm sure you're all quite well aware of, is that all recent surveys reveal that church membership has declined sharply since the turn of the millennium. In fact, the nuns, and you probably have gotten used to hearing that term too, those are the people that check none on the box when the surveys ask for what is your religious background or membership or whatever. And anyway, these nuns are now the largest group in the United States. There are more nuns than there are Catholics. There are more nuns than there are evangelical Protestants. So I think the last I read, based in, I think it was early this last spring, it was 27 to 28% of the United States. So it has grown, you know, dramatically just since I was last with you. There are many factors that have contributed to this trend, but the major factor cited by the nuns is the following. So I'm going to quote what they say is the main reason they're nuns rather than involved in any sort of organized religion. I just can't believe what churches believe. That's a pretty strong statement. So clearly the church needs to develop new language so that can communicate the Christian faith in a way that resonates with people today. And chief among the steps then will be learning to interpret the Bible afresh. So what I thought I would do is weave into that a little bit about what I've been up to in the past 10 years. If you can believe it's been 10 years. When I look in the mirror, yeah, I do see it's been 10 years, but it has been 10 years since I was last with you. In fact, 10 years and 5 months. So, or 6 months now. Well, I personally have found, as I shared with many of you when I was there, that the model of interpretation derived from the writings of Alfred North Whitehead and his process philosophy, especially his understanding of perception and language, holds tremendous promise for the way forward in biblical interpretation. So here starts the journey. Back in 1997, which now sounds like a long time ago, I published this little book. It's actually 300 pages. It's a pretty big book. It's entitled Beyond the Impasse, The Promise of a Process Hermeneutic. So you can see I felt that biblical studies had reached an impasse, and that if we're going to move beyond where we were in the 1990s, I felt that process hermeneutic offered great promise. Well, it actually was the first book-length exposition of this model. There were a lot of journal articles by some people that probably some of you have become aware of, like, well, John Cobb, for example, had written a number of articles, and then a number of New Testament people had as well, based upon this, but I was the first one to pull it together into a book-length exposition. And because it was my first book, I wrote it the way most young professors do. That is, I wrote it for graduate students and scholars, which means it's not very accessible to the general public. So since 1997, I've always had the goal of wanting to write an accessible presentation of this. That is, write in language that's more accessible. But as so often happens with good intentions, other commitments have gotten in the way time and time again. And in fact, the next book I was invited to write, because of my work with the Society of Biblical Literature in the area of apocalyptic literature, was a commentary on the book of Revelation. You know, that rather notorious book at the back of the Bible. I did write it in accessible language, so it can be read in the church, but obviously, since it's a commentary, only in the introductory area did I have a few pages to discuss my interpretive methodology. Still not the book I wanted to write, a book-length exposition. Then when the Interfaith Center was finally opened in Chapman University, some of you have been there. In fact, I know the group went over to Chapman once with me, and we met in the Interfaith Center, and Marv Meyer presented a presentation on his breakthrough work on the Gospel of Judas. Some of you may remember that. Marv has deceased now. It's really sad. He died at 64. Young, very young. But once that building was up and running, I ran into the same problem that most people have that moved from full-time teaching into 90% administration. And that is my pen dried up. So I could squeeze out a few small articles that I didn't have time to write. And in fact, that's the reason I moved to Ecuador. I wanted some time to read and think and write. And as an administrator, I wasn't getting that. So I moved to Ecuador. So I thought I'd share a little bit about the pictures of Ecuador, just so you can see what I'd been up to there. Make this quickly. But this was January 31st, 2011. That's all we took to Ecuador. So you can see some baggage and 2 cat carriers. Then we headed down south to Ecuador, which sometimes people forget it's on the Pacific side, but you know, it just sticks so far over, it's below Miami. And there's the little beach cottage that we built. We called it Casa de Cielo, House of Heaven, and we completed it. It was nearing completion in this picture in the fall of 2012. And there's another picture from the other side. So you can see it's a combination of beach and Spanish colonial, literally right on the beach. Here's a view from the balcony up there, looking sort of southwest. And then here's one in the evening from up there. We had gorgeous sunrises and sunsets there in Ecuador. And this is our front door. We wanted to combine our interest in religious studies with the indigenous culture there. This is a Chicana. It's similar to some things you'll see here among Native Americans, but it's also called sometimes the Inca cross. So we put that above our front door, so it felt at home for us. And we wanted some of that beautiful handmade wrought iron. This is the tall guy there. He actually made it. He bent all the iron work and all. So we put this on all of our windows. That was nearing the end of the completion of our house. You can see him doing it on this side as well. And then this is a morning picture, a breakfast that we're having looking straight west at the Pacific Ocean. So this was our scene for quite a while there in Ecuador. And then I'll pick up the next one in just a moment. But while I was in Ecuador, then this allowed me time to get back into reading, writing, and thinking. I supported us, well, me, our 2 cats, and Patricia. We were supported by my online teaching for Chapman through their Brandman program. And while I was there, I did get to do some scholarly work, which was very enjoyable. I traveled to Rio de Janeiro and gave a keynote address at a gathering of South American biblical scholars. So it was nice to introduce process thought to South America. And I wrote several essays, but obviously in a lecture and in essays, you still don't have the room to write a thorough exposition of how I think we should go about interpreting the Bible. So the last couple of years in Ecuador, I began what I called a grand project. Told Pat about this a little bit. I'd like to share it with you. I wanted to address the rapid decline of the church since the turn of the millennium. And to do that, I thought the first step is we've got to come up with a way of interpreting the Bible that makes sense to people today. And then beyond that, I really want to reinterpret Christianity, write it in language and in a means that makes sense to people of today. Because I think the nuns are correct. We're no longer speaking to them. It's interesting, on Pentecost Sunday, which is just a few weeks ago, I preached on this very topic because I reminded them that on the day of Pentecost, the people that were gathered there received the ability to speak in other languages so that they could express the message to people. Well, I think it's what the church needs to do again. I think the church has become largely unintelligible to the world around us. And so it's not that they reject us. They just think we don't count anymore. We don't have anything to say to them that makes sense. So this is my grand project, is to come up with a new way of thinking about Christianity. And the first step has to be learning how to deal with the Bible. So I got this all lined up while I was in Ecuador. And then 2 dramatic events got in the way. First is I developed a very serious illness and I had to come back to the States to have surgery. And while I was recuperating in New Mexico, because I could be near my family and spend time with them, and also because I wanted to look at the mountains, you know, the gorgeous Sandia Mountains there in New Mexico. While I was recuperating then, a tragedy occurred in Ecuador. And that is the beautiful Pacific coast where I'd been living for 5 years was struck by a 7.8 earthquake. And its epicenter was located offshore, less than 30 miles from where our little beach cottage stood. And sadly, our little cottage was destroyed, along with 80% of the buildings along a 200-mile stretch of the coast. I had just literally destroyed it. There was the 7.8 was the first, and then they had about 6.8 after that, 5 of them in a row. So what didn't fall the first time did afterwards. So I thought I would just, since you guys live in California and you're quite well aware of earthquakes, thought I would share with you a little bit of the power of a Pacific earthquake. Okay, here's the map, and you can see how they rate it. Green is rather strong, down to red is disastrous, okay? This was the center, the 7.8 earthquake. You can see it's just right on the equator. We lived outside of Hama on the coast between these 2 red dots. And you can see that all of the red was just devastated, and houses and buildings fell all the way from up here down to here and inland almost to the beginning of the mountains, the Andes. So it was a massive, massive earthquake. This is the Pacific Coast Highway in Ecuador. And you know PCH quite well. That's the PCH I traveled in Ecuador. And then this is the blacktop where you turn off the PCH to go down to our little fishing village. It just destroyed everything. Everything was destroyed. And then of course, there are all the sad pictures of people going through the pancake houses and all, trying to pull people out. There's a good shot of the pancaking of the buildings. And the people sitting out front with that's all their possessions they had. So since you guys know a lot about the feeling of the earth moving under your feet, you can see that. Well, I was in New Mexico, so I was on the phone and on the internet with people back in Ecuador all the time, see what it was like. And anyway, there were 676 people killed and over 16,600 injured. It was quite a severe earthquake. Well, that sort of changed what we had in mind because we didn't have a house to go back to. And, you know, given the fact it's a third world country, we couldn't, you know, it wasn't insured, couldn't rebuild. So it was just, okay, start a new chapter in our lives. So for the last few years, I had to put this grand project on the back burner again, because I've been doing 3 things. First, once I recovered sufficiently from surgery and all, Patricia and I needed to have new ministries to go back to. And we were fortunate that as soon as we, excuse me, put our papers out to the denomination, I immediately got a call from Missouri saying, "You guys used to live here, right?" And we said, "Yeah." I said, "We've got churches for both of you, come back." And sure enough, we both got churches just a few miles apart. Mine is a 150-year-old congregation. And surprisingly, I know you hear about Missouri on the news and it's always very negative. Well, there are pockets of progressive people in Missouri. And this rural congregation that's 150 years old is a progressive congregation. And so we've been there. And then Patricia also is in one. Hers is 100 and let me count it up here, 190 years old. So hers is one of the first Protestant congregations out in Missouri. It was founded by one of the founders of the Disciples of Christ, actually. That's how far back that church goes. So we've both been getting involved in getting our ministries going there. I've continued teaching part-time online, and we needed a place to live, and we were fortunate enough to buy a 1915 Craftsman bungalow in the historic district of a little town here in Middle Missouri. So those of you who have been to the Circle in Orange or been to Pasadena and you've seen all the Craftsman homes, we were able to find one. I won't tell you what we paid for it because you guys would cry because it's not even a factor of 10. It's much, much cheaper than in California. But I'm in the process of restoring that. So until recently, my grand project's been set on the back burner. And then last summer, well, actually it's last spring, at the very beginning of the pandemic, Patricia got a call from a publisher who's very interested in getting process thought out to the churches. That is, writing material that can be used in adult study groups, just like you guys. So she was asked to write a book called Beauty and Process Theology. And so it's another one you might want to look at studying sometime. Shortly after hers came out, he called me and said, now, how about you writing one on biblical studies? So this is the one that I wrote on process thought and biblical interpretation. And I was really delighted to get this chance. It really was a stimulus to get back into writing. There was one problem with it, and that's that these little booklets have 45-page maximum limit. And they put, those of you who looked at it, the print's pretty small, but it's just 45 pages. So there's still only so much you can say. But I was delighted to get to do it. And then to my surprise, about 2 months after this came out in March, I got a call from another publisher who said, I like what you did. Would you like to write a full book length treatment on explaining this approach to biblical interpretation? So I said yes. So I just agreed to that. And I'm finally, after 20 years, getting to write this book that I've had in the back of my mind. And it'll be like volume 1 of my 2-volume grand project. So give me a year and a half, and hopefully there'll be another book, but a little more detail about how you use the process hermeneutic. But picking up at that point, when one tries to rethink how one's going to understand the Bible, I mean, even more so, understand a whole religion, one of the things that comes to mind is the important act of interpretation. Interpretation is going to be key if we're going to read the Bible in such a way that it's useful to people today and re-express what we mean by Christianity. That is, come up with a new language, new words, how to express it all, new metaphors. Now, when it comes to interpretation, interpretations can vary widely depending upon how they conceive of the interpretive process. So for example, we give you the two approaches that you're probably familiar with. Some Christians look at the Bible as a rich repository of fixed doctrine or absolute truth or straightforward language. And I'll put up a chart to show this in a moment. Whereas other people look at the Bible as religious myth expressing spiritual truths, but it's done in figurative, polyvalent language of poetry and metaphor. So let me put that up here in a chart, because as you probably remember, I love to put things on the board. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. There's a conservative approach to biblical interpretation, and it looks at the Bible as a repository of fixed doctrines, that is, absolute truths. And this is expressed in straightforward, descriptive language. And of course, this whole approach is called literalism. The Bible is read literally. And that means that the language is univocal language, which univocal literally means speaking with one voice. Uni is one, vocal, so it's language speaks with only one voice. So it's a straightforward, descriptive, literal reading of the Bible. The other approach, which Manhattan Beach is far more familiar with, is the progressive approach to biblical interpretation. And that is, we understand the Bible to be composed largely of what's called myth. Now, there's a problem there, and that's why I've got this big note here I want us to read together. Unfortunately, the word myth, as used today, has negative connotations due to the fact that the word has come to mean a belief or idea that is false. For example, what are the myths about COVID? When I see pamphlets like that, I want to pull my hair because it's using the word that I use all the time, but in a very negative way. You see, the term, as used in literary circles and religious studies, is not a negative term. It's a positive term. So here's the background for that. The Greek word is mythos. That's where our English word myth comes from. Mythos literally means story or narrative. Notice it doesn't say true story or false story, it just says story. Now, many of the ancient myths involve supernatural beings. Remember the mythology of Greece that you studied in school? And it gave pre-scientific explanations for natural and social phenomena. Now, because of that, the word myth began to be denigrated to mean something that's false or untrue, because it does this pre-scientific and it talks about gods and goddesses and all that. Well, let's go back and look at the word myth the way it used to be used and the way it still is used in academic circles. You pick up right here. In academic circles, the word myth is positive. A myth is an organizing story that gives meaning to everyone's life. Everyone operates out of a mythic framework, even if one has never consciously articulated that myth. So think of myth as the big story that makes sense out of the little stories of our lives. This is the big narrative, the framing narrative that makes sense for us. And we use these myths then to regulate and interpret our lives, to find worth and purpose, that is, to find meaning in life. Now, here's the example I would always give in class. Every one of those people sitting in the classroom in front of me believed in the myth of education. The myth of education. That story or that narrative says that if you continue to study and expand yourself, you will become a more expansive person. You'll enjoy life more and you'll do all of, and that's why churches keep doing education. It's a cradle to grave thing we should do. Constantly be expanding ourselves by education. But as I ask my classes, when I would be using this example, I say, how many of you had friends from high school who didn't go on to college? And of course, they'd all, they'd be raising their hands and they'd say, well, why did they not go into college? Well, they were eager to start their career and make more money. And of course, for a long time, they made more money than the person who was still going to school and not earning much money and spending money on their education. But even eventually that broke down to where they wound up in jobs that paid more. But it was clear that some people believe the myth of education and some people do not. But if you believe in it, it shapes how you view life. Like when I graduated high school, I had been well indoctrinated into the myth of education. I knew I was going on to college. I was so grounded in the myth of education when I finished my college degree, I said, I've got to go to graduate school. And then after graduate school, I said, I'm still not ready. I've got to go to postdoctoral work, and just kept going. And finally, I did reach a point where I thought it's time to go out in the real world. But I was 30 years old by that point before I ever left. But the myth of education really helped govern my life. Well, everybody on the planet is living out of some mythology, some myth that gives meaning and order and purpose to life. Part of the reason that we have the culture wars of today is people are working out of two different mythologies. And if you're working out of a different mythology, it's hard to talk to one another because what you're seeing and the other person's seeing are two different things. They may be looking at the same thing, but what they're seeing is radically different. And what it really boils down to is we need to quit trying to talk to people on that level, move back a step to their mythology. They're assumptions, they're presuppositions that dictate everything they do. But that's something that doesn't work on the sound bites on television. They'd rather see people arguing, which gets you nowhere. It's a rare program on television that gets back to the mythology at work, to the assumptions and the presuppositions people hold. But only at that stage can we start connecting. So what I'm suggesting is that rather than reading the Bible as some sort of fixed doctrine, some absolute truths that were handed down one time only and you hang on to it forever, read the Bible as mythology and try to see what it's saying. And what mythology does is it's trying to express spiritual teachings in the Bible. This is religious mythology, not educational mythology or political mythology or what other mythology. It's religious mythology, it's spiritual. So it's trying to teach spiritual truths. And it does through the following: figurative language. Most of the Bible is expressed figuratively. Some of it's quite apparent. It's metaphor, it's poetry. But all of it is polyvalent. I love that word when I learned that word years ago. Polyvalent, valent means it's speaking or sounds. Poly means many. So everything you read or say has more than one meaning. It speaks many voices at one time. Now, what this means is both of these approaches, if you're not careful, whether it's the conservative approach or the progressive approach, by its practitioners tends to become fossilized as fixed teachings. So what you wind up with is the conservative or fundamentalist teaching and the liberal or progressive teaching. But sadly, most people view this as fixed doctrines. That is, they're fossilized, they're fixed. Well, what my metaphysic is saying is that we should not view language in that way. Let me get back here for just a minute. What if we were to conceive of language differently? That is, rather than it teaching fixed things, what if the purpose of language is to spark the imagination, to spark the imagination of the hearer or reader? That is, by sparking our imagination, the language generates fresh proposals about the way things might be or could be. And all of these, do you feel that leaning forward in them? You're not talking about what is for all time and eternity. You're talking about proposals about the way things might be or could be. There's a forward pull to the language. It's not communicating fixed, timeless information or doctrines or dogmas. These are proposals that lure you forward into the advance of life. Now, let me unpack these paragraphs with three things. I want to talk a little bit about the indeterminacy of language, and I'll explain what I mean by indeterminacy, but the indeterminacy of language. And the second is the evolutionary nature of text, whether they be written or oral, and you seeing language as these lures for feelings that spark the imagination. So first, let me talk just a bit about, excuse me, Whitehead's understanding of perception and language. Whitehead's philosophy, as you read his books, you discern a clear shift from modernism's understanding of language to postmodernism's understanding of language. Now here I need to put up a figure for you to look at and also talk a bit about those words. Get that up here again. Okay, by modernism, I'm referring to the period, basically Enlightenment to the present. So roughly late 17th century to today. Modernism has understood language as univocal. That is, it speaks with one voice, only has one meaning. Therefore, language is precise. It's distinct, and it's a literal description of reality. So for the past 300 years, that's the way we've been understanding language. Now, is anybody in the group a English professor? If so, probably you have found yourself saying, people today don't know how to read poetry, metaphor, figurative language. And the reason is everything else we're doing is expressed in modern understanding of language. We read language like it's fixed, like it's a clear statement of literal reality. But postmodernism understands language quite differently. It sees that language is polyvalent. It speaks with many voices, that it's analogical. By analogical, we mean we teach in comparison by using a metaphor or a simile. You know, simile says something that's like or as, and metaphor just simply states it, like the moon, the blue moon. Instead of the moon is like it's blue. So metaphor and simile. Therefore, language is imprecise. And here's another nice big term to learn, plurisignificant. It means it signifies or means many things at the same time. Multiple significances simultaneously is the way language works. And also, it's value laden. Now, you hear so much about value-free education. And I'm looking at Pat right now because as an educator, she's heard that phrase over and over, and she probably shakes her head every time she hears it. Oh, we're going to do this value-free. No, everything a person does is value-laden. You're making choices by whatever you do. What's a choice? It's choosing between two values. So everything is value-laden. You can't just say things are neutral. There's always value involved in it. So language is value-laden. Okay, we'll come back to this in a moment. Get back to my lecture here. There's a philosopher and literary theorist named Philip Wheelwright. Now, he didn't write in conjunction with Whitehead, but they wind up saying the same thing, except Peter Wheelwright's language is a little easier to follow. So I'm going to use his. He says there are two different ways of understanding language. One of them he calls steno language and the other tensive language. I'll put up a chart in a moment to show that. He says that a steno language, a symbol refers to one and only one thing, whereas tensive language, a symbol can evoke a host of related meanings. But really, what Whitehead and Wheelwright say is that language lies along that spectrum. So let me put up a chart to picture this. This chart right here. Tensive language and steno language. And truth, language lies somewhere along the spectrum anytime you're speaking. Some language tries to move to this end. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have read a lot of scientific articles. Have you noticed how the first thing you do in a scientific article is define your terms? Because if your reader doesn't follow your terms the way you're reading them, they'll get a totally different idea. So scientific language attempts to move toward this end of the spectrum. Let me give you an example. You've all seen pi r squared and symbols such as that. What does pi stand for? 3.14, and it goes on and on and on like that. What happens if you change the meaning of pi? Well, your formulas don't work. So when scientists use pi, or if you're a literary person like me, it's pronounced P, that's the way the Greeks did. But anyway, pi, you know that in that formula, you're to substitute 3.14. You can't use any other value. Pi is 3.14. Otherwise, you won't get the circumference of the circle and all of that. Now, pi means that, but even in scientific language, did you know that there's another use of that character pi? It comes from chemistry. There are pi bonds. And pi bonds have nothing to do with 3.14. And if you go on any campus, you'll see people wearing the Greek letter pi on their sweatshirts. And they're not talking about 3.14. They're talking about the fraternity or the sorority they belong to, like Phi Beta Kappa. You know, so even something that we think of in science as fixed and determinate and clear and straightforward and literal, well, it's not. That's why you have to say, in this scientific journal article, we're using pi to represent 3.14. You can't have somebody thinking pi bonds in chemistry or the pi on Phi Beta Kappa. That's a totally different thing. So some language deliberately tries to move to this end, but even scientific language never gets it fixed. It's never one-to-one. Pi doesn't always mean 3.14. It can mean pi bonds, and it can mean one of the letters in a fraternity or sorority. So even pi doesn't have a one-to-one reference. But language like scientific language, rational language, legal language, have you ever noticed how careful legal language is written? You want to precisely state what you're including and what you're not. And then when you have a difference of opinion, you go to court and the judge tells you what is limited and what's included and what's excluded. And even our everyday language. When we're talking to one another, like I'm talking now, I'm hoping you're hearing the words the same way I'm intending them, because I'm trying to speak in everyday discourse that we use every day. But let's remember, none of our language gets down to a one-to-one that is completely determinate meaning. No word, no symbol ever has a one-to-one meaning. It's somewhere along here. Now, some other language deliberately tries to go the other direction. Now, it never makes it out to the hypothetical extreme, but it moves in that direction of tensive language. That's the language of poetry. Let me give you an example. Here's a poem, and how are we doing time-wise? Okay. My love is a red, red rose. My love is a red, red rose. When I ask classes to explain what I'm meaning, hands will shoot up and they'll say, yeah, you're saying that your love is beautiful. And those of you who have met Patricia, yeah, she's beautiful. Okay, that works. My love smells good. Well, yeah, Patricia smells good. Okay, I can get that. My love is red. Well, no, she's not red. She's very fair with dark hair. Or how about this one? Somebody will come up and say, oh, no. I think what you're saying is your relationship with your loved one is thorny. Remember, roses have thorns. So which of these things am I saying when I say my love is a red, red rose? Actually, I'm probably saying all of them, but I have one in mind, but you might hear another one. And therefore for you, you're hearing something else. Or take the word run, R-U-N, R-U-N. Okay, here's a sentence. And if I were to ask you how you would interpret it, you'd give me one of these meanings. Here's the sentence. She runs like a deer. Well, you would probably say, well, she runs gracefully. Or she runs on all fours. Or she runs by jumping. But actually, I was thinking in terms of the John Deere tractor. She runs like a deer. Some of you who've come off the farm, that's their slogan. She runs like a deer. But I actually, when I was in seminary, I worked at a church called Pleasant Run. And run didn't refer to motion. It didn't refer to running like a tractor. Run referred to a little creek. That's how they referred to a creek, a run. And the church was on a little creek called Pleasant. So it was Pleasant Run Church. So you can see that language is slippery. It never gets to this end, nor does it ever get to this end, but it operates somewhere in there. But certain types of literature move one direction or the other. Poetry, metaphor, religious language. Why would religious language move toward the one-to-many? Think what you're trying to express in religious language. You're trying to speak about something which is ultimate, something that is infinite, and yet you're expressing it in finite human language. That's all we have is human language. That's why all of our language about spiritual things is analogical. So this is the first thing I'd want to point out, is that as we approach the Bible, if we buy into what Wheelwright has here as his example, or what Whitehead is saying, language is always plurisignificant. It speaks with many voices simultaneously. It depends upon who's listening. And therefore, fixed doctrine is problematic because religious language is moving toward this end anyway. And the more you move toward this end, the more it refers to many things. Now, hang on to that for a moment because we're going to end with a note about spirituality and my definition of spirituality. Okay, we'll come to that one in just a moment. Now, that being the case, we need to talk about the evolutionary nature of text. And by that, I'm just going to show another diagram here. This one. Let circle A, which is this right here, represent all of the propositions that the original writer of a text has in mind. In other words, that's what the author is intending to say, what's in the brain and trying to put it in this text. Okay. Circle B is what, say, the original readers heard. And circle C is what we hear today. Now notice, there is an overlap of circles, number one. So there can be genuine literal communication that takes place between the original author, the original readers, and even us today. We can, and this is, we try to get back to this largely through historical criticism, trying to understand what was going on. But notice that even the original hearers or readers of that text heard some things that this person wasn't having in mind. And then today, we hear even more things in the text that the original author didn't have in mind, but we hear. I call this the growing edge of tradition. In other words, all language grows through time. Let's put it this way. How many times have you been talking to someone and it's something you're trying to communicate to them and they say, oh, you mean, and then they'll say something and you'll think, no, that wasn't what I was trying to say. But now that you say it, yeah, my words do say that, don't they? We always say more and less than we're intending to say. That's just the nature of language because it's plurisignificant. So if you think of this first circle as the original biblical text that you're studying, and the second circle as one set of readers, and then the third circle here as readers today, we're all reading the same text, sort of, but different readers and hearers are hearing things in the text that no one else has heard. Let me give you a specific example. We've all read Genesis 1 and 2. We're familiar with the creation story. And we know that you've heard sermons about how we are to be stewards of God's creation. Do you think that any of the original Hebrew people responsible for putting that text in its form that we read it today in Genesis had in mind the contemporary ecological situation or the past possibility we have by blowing up the entire planet with nuclear power? See, we hear things in the text that they never heard. For them, nature was big and people were small. They couldn't have conceived of modern day scopes of pollution. They certainly couldn't conceive of weapons that could destroy life on this planet. But we do. Because of the experiences that we've had, we now go back to reading Genesis 1 and 2, and we hear things in that text that the authors never intended. And here's the exciting part. I would suggest that what a text may come to mean may be far more important than anything it has ever meant in the past. That is, the Bible can once again become a living word. It's still addressing people. We have concerns and worries that the ancient people never would have had. And yet when we read their words, it can speak to us if we use our imaginations. And when we think of in terms of stewardship, we now think in terms of ecological lifestyle. We think of the need to be sure that we have negotiated treaties with other countries so we don't get involved in a nuclear war. And who knows? Today we've had spaceships going up carrying non-governmental personnel. Who knows what the future may have in mind? So this approach to reading any sort of text, whether it be scripture or anything, shows you that language has this ability to lure us forward into fresh proposals. Now, I can't cover all the language I'd like to do about that, about the lures, but let me basically just say this, that when you're studying the Bible, or any literature for that matter, there are certain things in the text that Whitehead calls lures. I like to think of it as it woos us forward. Woo is a love word. It's enticing us forward. So when we read text, we need to look at the lures that are present in the text. And that by doing this, I'm not sure how much time we have left, so I want to close with this. The goal is, by being lured forward, we open ourselves. As language is open to the future, we begin to open ourselves to the future. And that is my definition of spirituality, because to be spiritual means to be able to incorporate more into yourself. If God is the most spiritual and everything exists within God, as Paul put it, in God we live and move and have our being. By the way, this is panentheism, if you're familiar with that term. If God is the most spiritual, that means God has included all. And the more that we are able to include what we used to think of as foreign to us within our frame of reference now, we become more spiritual. But if we look at the Bible as fixed deposit, as expressed in literal descriptions of reality, as doctrine or dogma, to use the church term, we stay fixed and closed. But if we view the language as lures that try to spark our imagination, to open ourselves to more, because that's the way language actually works, then we open ourselves and we become bigger. My wife put it in an interesting way. In fact, one of her books is entitled Fat Soul, Philosophy of Life. Our goal is to become fat. And we usually think of fat as a negative thing, but a fat soul is a bigger soul, one that is able to include more and more and harmonize it. But the more we can widen ourselves out, then we're becoming more godlike, because God holds all within God. And if we're opening ourselves up, we're expanding our horizons, and we're broadening ourselves, then we're experiencing spiritual growth. So that takes us exactly an hour. So I wanted to be sure we save time for some discussion. There's a lot more I could give about this, but you'll find most of it in the book if you want to read through it and see some of that. And then I'll be writing this other book to express it in more detail and a lot more examples and things like that. But I'd be glad to have some discussion with you. That's one thing I always valued about this group.
Good. Thank you, Ron. Let's let the people online have a chance to first questions. If anybody's online wants to unmute themselves and ask Ron a question.
I have a question, Ron.
Hi, good to see you.
I can only see your chart up there. Oh, there you are.
Oh, I'll get it down so it makes it smaller. Better?
Thank you. I was thinking, in the example you gave of different ways of interpreting the Genesis passage, you said, that really it takes on a much deeper meaning and more significant for us today than it did when the writers wrote it. It was much more complicated. So there's some passages that we would take and say that they take on more meaning. But then there are those other passages that we say, am I right? We say, well, that's within a particular historical context. And that meant that for that particular time. But we really can't carry that over to today. I was thinking of the one that came to mind was Paul saying women should be covered when they go to church meetings, I think. That might, he certainly can't take it literally. It certainly doesn't seem to have a whole lot of meaning to me, but it might reflect a whole cultural, contextual idea.
Right. And that's an excellent point to ask about, because I've been talking about how some passages can take on more meaning and be even more profound. What do we do with those that are clearly historically and culturally conditioned? That's the phrase I like to use. In other words, they're clearly an expression of a particular culture at a particular historical point. And the one about women is a great one to use. Okay, the way that we do that is, if you're a conservative, well, women, be silent in church, right? You can't have women pastors. You would not believe the number of conservative Christians that have attacked my wife, because she was one of the first women ordained that took biblical studies and preaching courses when she was in seminary. No, women are supposed to take religious education courses because they're supposed to be Sunday school teachers and education leaders in the church. They're not to be the pastor of a church. She says, no, I'm going to take all these courses. And so, she's faced this, head on. So obviously, from a progressive standpoint, we tend to just say, no, that's very historically and culturally conditioned. We don't follow that passage. Here's the danger the progressive side can follow if they don't jump into the type of hermeneutic I'm talking about. We then just do what Thomas Jefferson did to his Bible. Get out a pair of scissors and cut out the passages you don't think fit your culture anymore. Literally, Thomas Jefferson did that. It's called the Jeffersonian New Testament. You can find it in the library. That's called excision. And typically, that's what progressive people have done. They have just excised those parts of the Bible that no longer are relevant to us today. Okay, what mine suggests doing is, no, you're still getting too literal, even in your progressive approach to it. Let it spark your imagination. Now, first off, you'd say, what did this mean historically? And you could go back and find out why Paul said what Paul said. And just a little bit on that as a way of explanation. Paul was actually quite a feminist for his day. Surprising as that sounds, he was a feminist because his vision is expressed in Galatians. He says, in Christ, there's no longer male and female. So clearly he's saying, we shouldn't be making these distinctions. But Paul also lived in the real world. So Galatians expresses his vision. By the way, notice that whole statement. In Christ, there's neither rich or poor, slave or free, male or female. the three major cultural barriers we use to divide ourselves up: socioeconomic, men and women, and the idea of slavery, which, it's still here, unfortunately, in some cultures. But Christ, he's saying that in Christ, these should be done away with. That Christ broke down the wall of partition, he says in another passage. So if that's his vision, why does he write what he writes in 1 Corinthians? Because you were quoting 1 Corinthians 12 about, women are wearing a head covering and women not speaking in church. It's interesting. In that culture, he's speaking to women because he's concerned about reaching out to the culture. And he says there were two types of church meetings in the ancient world. There was the meeting when only Christians were present, and there was a meeting that was open to the public. Anybody could come in. In the closed meeting, he says women can pray and prophesy. That is, lead in corporate prayer, preach. But when the outsiders are present, women are to be silent. Now, you say, well, how does that fit with the head covering? Well, the head covering in that culture was a symbol of marriage. And in fact, I just took it off so I could get it out easier. So I thought this question might come up. What does this symbolize in our culture?
It says marriage.
Ownership.
Ownership.
Not quite, not quite.
Yeah, it shows that we're married. But we've all heard stories about when, one of them, man or woman, goes out of town on business, that comes off. And of course, sometimes there's a little white ring there that shows. But anyway, that would be denouncing your marriage. Whereas in our culture, the wedding ring symbolized. In that culture, it was a head covering, the way they covered their hair. Young women were not to wear head covering. Prostitutes could not wear head covering. Only married women. And so when you go back in culture, you can understand more what he's saying. But the question is, it's still not something we'd follow today. Why is that? Well, here's how we can use it today without doing it literally, either rejecting it or doing it. That is, ask what is operating beneath the surface. Mm-hmm. And what we see is, Paul says, because of our concern to bring our message out to a public where women are subservient, where slaves do exist, then let us voluntarily limit our freedom when we're on display, so to speak. Now, Paul said, when you're together and it's just Christians, you better start acting like, what this vision says. Remember the letter to Philemon? That's a very historically cultural letter. Philemon is written about a runaway slave named Onesimus. His owner was a man named Philemon, who wasn't just a Christian. He had the church meet in his house. He is a church leader. Onesimus ran away and took something of value to finance his journey away. And he ran into Paul in Rome. And Paul had a decision to make. What do I do? I mean, technically by Roman law, you belong to Philemon and I have to send you back. And Paul's very concerned about the Roman interpretation of Christians because Christians are already quite a suspicious group. And he doesn't want Rome to come down and extinguish Christianity because it could have happened very easily. So what he does is he sends Onesimus back carrying the letter to Philemon. And in the letter, Paul basically rakes Philemon over the coals. He describes who Onesimus is, the good that he's been to Paul, the fact that he is my son in the faith, just like you are my son in the faith. They're brothers. In other words, and then he says later, toward the end of the letter, I'll come and visit you next time I get out of prison. In other words, I'm going to come and check up on you. Have you followed through with what I'm saying? So basically, Paul had to limit what he said publicly, but he clearly said slavery is wrong. That he is your brother. He's not your slave in the letter. And if you're a Christian and I'm a Christian talking to a Christian, I'll tell you that. But Paul couldn't come out with a whole campaign public campaign on the internet of his day trying to overturn slavery. That would have been foolish, because Christianity would have been exterminated because Rome was built upon slavery. So when we go back and interpret it historically, we can understand what Paul's saying. Now, we don't want to repeat what Paul's saying, but we're going to see what's he doing. So what you see Paul doing is saying, you may need to voluntarily limit something for the sake of someone else. Don't let them put you in slavery again. But, don't be a slave, but limit your freedom in Christ. But in Christ, you are free. And when you're with Christians, they better start acting like that. So the church hasn't moved very far from Paul's day, unfortunately. The church began to fossilize all this stuff. The conservative or traditional wing of the church reads those passages literally and says you practice them. The progressive church, which is more in the spirit of Paul, says, no, this doesn't apply to us anymore, but we cut it out of our Bible. I'm suggesting a third option. That is, it's not an either or, an A or B choice. We need to somehow come to something that transcends these other two. And by sparking our imagination, we can read these texts and find meaning in it. For example, I don't know what was preached at your church today in the service. I preached on the Gospel of Mark today, the lectionary reading. And as I prefaced it to the congregation, this is not an uplifting thing to read. In fact, it's distressing, it's deplorable, and it's awful. You remember, it was the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. So I told all the backstory historically about why John the Baptist wound up being beheaded. And you say, okay, if you've done all this, gosh, I mean, it's an interesting historical sermon, but what does it do for us spiritually? Okay, here's the spiritual thing I drew out of it. That's neither saying we're to be like Herod or to be like John the Baptist, but they represent two different models of power. We all exercise power. What is the highest form of power? Well, one model tells us the highest form of power is brute force. It's the ability to coerce others into doing what we want them to do. That is imperial power, and it's still widely used in the church, unfortunately. But it's definitely used outside the church. The other form of power is the power of persuasive love, the power to woo someone, the power to pull that which is best out of them for their highest good. It's not a brute force, it's persuasive. So persuasion versus brute power. Now, the example I gave them in our talking after the sermon was this. Look at what's going on right now over cyber attacks, the ransoming and all. Putin is a very good example of imperial power at work, the power of coercion, brute force. Now, how is Joe Biden going to deal with him on this without resorting to brute force? We don't want him to resort to brute force because we know what that will lead to. But how is he going to do it in a persuasive fashion? So you've got two forms of power at work. In the long run, the persuasive power wins. It always does historically. If you just look back over history, as Martin Luther King said, and many others, he wasn't the one that coined it. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. And as I study history, that's one of the biggest benefits I've seen. Evil never wins in the long run. Or it does in the short run, because you can coerce something into happening and get it done. But in the long run, that never works. In the long run, persuasive power of love is what works. In fact, here's what I always suggest about brute force. Evil has within itself the germ of its own destruction. And given time, it will destroy itself. We don't live under the Third Reich, do we? It certainly looked like we were going to for a while. Had we not shipped in some things for England, England would have fallen. I mean, the dominoes were falling east and west for quite a while. But it eventually destroyed itself. Oh, yes, there was a lot of push from other places, but that's just the way evil is. It eventually destroys itself. Brute force never wins ultimately, only the power of love, the persuasive power. Think about the movie Gandhi. Do you remember the scene where they're going across the bridge and the British at the end of it clubbing the people, and they fall off the bridge down into the valley below, the gully below. The women are down bandaging their heads and all of that, fixing them up. Then they go up and get in line and come across the bridge again. You remember that scene? And finally, the British soldiers said, I'm not going to hit any more people. This is stupid. And they laid down their clubs and left. You know, the brute force never wins ultimately. The power of persuasive love does. So when we go back to passages like the passages on women that are disturbing, rather than just simply caving in and saying, yes, we'll follow that teaching, like our conservative Christian friends, and rather than just excising that passage, like our progressive friends, although I'd agree more with them, let's move a step beyond the either or choice and move to this third approach that seeks to get down into the lures that are operating in the text and see what sort of persuasive lure can lead us beyond the either or option into something that's useful, something you can preach from the pulpit, so to speak. And these passages about women, that's exactly how I handle them. I don't agree with what they were doing today. That's not the way we should be. The same with passages on slavery. And you can pick any number of passages from the Bible that are not relevant to us today. We should not be following them. And by the way, our conservative friends, they nitpick which ones they're going to follow. They don't follow the Bible literally. They just don't. But they'll argue over certain things that they say they're following. But rather than just excise those passages, look for the lures that are in there and extract those lures and see how they'll pull you forward into something beyond the either or choice. Thanks so much for bringing that one up. Great. Other comments or questions?
I need to.
Okay, you have a question?
No, not a question. Well, yeah, I have a question. So, Ron, looking forward a year or whatever.
Oh, Jim.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that Jim?
Yes.
Yes, uh-huh.
Can you see our room?
No.
No, you can't.
No, I can't see. There's just the Manhattan Beach Church sign there.
I can't fix it, Ron.
Okay.
I can't fix it.
All right. So what is the next step? One possibility is a year from now, we could try to do the same thing, link up with you. And I need to talk to our members and get feedback here. Or another approach is to wait a year and a half until your book comes out and follow up with that. Or is there something we ought to be doing much sooner than that?
Well,
what's your preference?
I can tell you one thing I would love to do. I'm going to try it with my church too. When I get the first draft of my book written before it's published, I'd love to have some people read it and give me feedback. Because my goal is to express this way of reading the Bible in ways that are understandable by anybody, any adult, to be able to read it. Well, any adult who at least is trying to think about it. Because I mean, I've got it here in this format, but I can tell you, Pat, have you looked at this one?
Yeah, yes, I have the small one.
But just the big one.
Oh no,
Yeah.
I haven't. I don't have that one.
It's all in here, but I use the language that you're supposed to use when you're in the academy. When scholars get together and meet and discuss, that's what this is written in. and it's just not accessible. It's not, no, the concepts in it aren't things you would immediately grasp, but it's the way it's expressed. And so this one that you have looked at a little bit, did you find this readable enough to where you could follow what I was trying to get at?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to write a whole book like that so that it's understandable with lots of illustrations, because I'm a big believer in illustrations. I think that if you can say what you're saying and then illustrate it, then it's easier to grasp. And I will probably have a lot of charts and diagrams in it as well, because I like to think visually too. Just look at it, and like that thing about the spectrum. That I drew that up out of his book. He didn't have that spectrum. I said, okay, it looks like this, and they have these two ends that are hypothetical, but language operates toward the two ends. All of that. So once I could diagram it for myself, I understood it better. So I would love to get a draft of this done, or maybe do it piecemeal, like section at a time. I don't know. That would be another way. But that's what I'm going to try to do with my congregation here, is do it in good bite-sized chunks and have them look at it and say, well, I follow you here, but this doesn't make any sense. And so then I know what I need to work on to get it clearer. But yeah, I would love to do something like that, to have your input as I write this book.
Ron, the book you are recommending to us, how can we get it from Amazon? How do we get it?
Oh, yeah, Amazon, probably the easiest way. It's 45 pages. So, and that includes the front matter. So, I mean, you see, I was really conscribed as to how much I could write. I think it's, yeah, $5.99 on so it's not an expensive thing. But it's the type of thing that was designed.
So I will post that in the link where the recording is, so everybody will be able to go there and see it if they want to order it.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'll send it out to our local email group. I'll send you guys all the link.
Yeah, if people could get that and read it, and it would be good for, like, each chapter could be a 1 or 2 Sundays discussion that you would have among yourselves.
All right.
Something like that, because it was written. Well, what the guy calls these is topical line drives down here. And so he's trying to have people on different subject matters write a concise introductory thing to whatever it is. And I'm number 45, so it's 44 of them ahead of me that he's had different, and they're written by different people, kind of condense what they're doing. And then if people like this, then they're hopefully will use some of the, in the back we have readings, a small bibliography and things like that to point people to more. But that would be what I would suggest, is that this could, because it's supposed to be able to be used in adult classes at church, is the idea behind it, as introductions to these.
Ron, let me finish here. We got to close very soon. But as far as having a video connection with you a year from now or whatever, what is your preference for that?
Oh, I'm definitely open to that if this time works for you guys. If I know which Sunday we work on together, and I get my calendar so that I can be home in time. Yeah, it'd be great to see all of your smiling faces again periodically. That was one of the things I really missed in Ecuador, was this group. This was a great group to be with, and I was so delighted. I remember the first time I was asked to come was in 2005.
So Ron, so I'll pull our memory, but I'm sure we'll want to have you come back and do something like this.
Yes.
But if we don't want to wait a full year, when would you be willing to do this again? Oh,
not that long. I mean, I think it'd be great if you can all get the book, and maybe, well, we could even do chapter by chapter. I'd be happy to come back, after you guys have met and read and met and discussed it. And then, I wouldn't give a lecture. It'd be more like this, the give and take discussion on that chapter. And then a month or two later, come back with chapter 2, and then, that type of thing. It'd be very helpful to me, actually, to get more feedback.
Well, we will pursue that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I vote for that. That would be wonderful.
All right, we need to get the book.
Yeah.
So,
I think we've had all the questions here, Ron. Thank you so much for your presentation. Oh, what, Rich is
Oh,
going to
wait,
ask.
we have another question.
Okay. Rich?
I've got a quick question. It may be too personal. I don't know. I'm just curious. How do you like being a pastor in a small church as opposed to being a professor of religion at a university?
Well, if you were to go to my church, you'd find that I'm far more professor at that church than I am your typical pastor. I teach an adult Bible study group every Wednesday night, which is, college level stuff. And my sermons tend to be very teaching oriented. It's an interesting situation since we both wanted to only work part-time. Our first idea was we would work together. We'd take one position and then we would split it, because we'd preach every other week, whichever, and then divide up the different facets of a church that way. So that was what our ideal was when we started. Okay, we'll go back, to work, but we both only want to work part-time now, and we'll just split up a position. But then before we even got far enough to talk to any churches, we got this call from Missouri, and they said, hey, we've got 4 churches right now. You can have any of the 4 of them, I am sure, and come back. So we both came back, and he said, you go to this church and talk to them, you go to this. And sure enough, it was just done just like that. And they were both part-time churches because they're not large like Manhattan Beach, but they're smaller congregations. We were just fortunate that here in mid-Missouri, I think largely because Disciples churches are so old here, and because of the connection, almost everybody in the church works somehow connected to the university setting or the university hospital. They tend to be far more progressive minded anyway. So, our regional minister knew that we would fit in any of these churches. So it's different. I still think of myself as a teacher, not a pastor, but and the congregation agrees. My sermons are more teaching oriented than what they're used to. But as long as I can be myself, it works okay. I never thought I would be clergy again. I did that when I was a seminary, but once I got into the university setting, that's where I spent my life.
Well, I just wanted to, in case you hadn't heard, to remind you that there's going to be an opening in this church coming up pretty soon, and wanted to kind of test out how you felt about being a minister.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, they're probably looking for someone a little younger than me. But yeah, we found that it works well. At the start of our career, we did co-pastor together. And some people say, oh, you can't work with your husband or wife. We worked really well together. And so that was early on, we did that. And then Patricia stayed in the church for a good long time doing another church when we moved to California. And then went from there, because of her education leanings, into the Tustin school system, where she worked with at-risk kids, one-on-one tutoring. Took the ones that police would bring in, and because they were either runaways or problems with drugs, or the girl was pregnant and all this. And rather than letting them drop out of school, she just met with them one-on-one. So that's how she moved from ministry into education again. But fortunately, she had 3 master's degrees, so it was easy for her to move around wherever she wanted to do things.
So from the standpoint of being a teacher, only a teacher, Jesus was a teacher.
What? I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
Jesus was a teacher.
Oh yeah, Jesus was a teacher. Yeah, and so I try to model myself that way, because maybe part of the reason is that preaching sometimes has the connotation of preaching down to. I mean, it doesn't need to, but it does in our culture. you know, it's always somebody preaching down at somebody, and it's usually kind of negative feeling. Whereas teaching, I've always viewed more horizontally, give and take. At least that's the way I always taught at the university setting. You know, more, I would present something and then we'd discuss it, and present it and discuss it. And some of my favorite moments were when students would come by the office and sit down and, I want to go further on this, you know, and then we dialogue with people. But yeah, the teaching has always been a big part of what I enjoy.
So
do you have those open discussions on Sunday mornings occasionally for a different format?
We have, especially when we were on Zoom, we did more of that than in the setting. But like today, I teach Sunday school before church every day too. Oh. So, and like today, I was teaching the adults that had gathered, and we have our discussions back and forth and all of that. And then I usually, we're meeting right now in the sanctuary because they can spread out more and, you know, feel safer, especially with the new variant coming up here in Missouri, because people won't get the shot. But anyway, so I just carry my robe in with me and lay it up there in the pulpit, and I teach down front, and then I slip on my robe and get up in the chancel and preach. So it's kind of a seamless thing. Well, we do have a brief pause because the deacons and elders and I, for that day, meet in the chapel for just a little bit to pray before we come start the service. But that's the only pause between the two. And I don't really think I change who I am much at all between the Sunday school and the pulpit. And they're happy with it. They seem to like it.
So Ron, I will follow up with you. I've got your email. I've got your phone number, I think, as well. I'll copy Pat is plugged in. And we'll decide after I get more people. So with that, we're going to close down, I think.
Okay. Well, I will look forward to seeing you guys at some point in the future then. This will be fun.
Good. Thank you very much.
Oh my gosh. He's so
nice to see you, Ron.
Nice to see all of you. And so
thank you so much.
I could remember some names and faces even. This is really cool. 10 years.
Oh, that's good. We haven't gotten too old that you don't recognize them.
No, I recognize Rich when he popped on the screen. Yep, that's Rich.
Thank you.